Have you ever wondered how it was possible for a country that excelled in technology, with the most advanced weapons and the best tanks, artillery, airplanes, submarines, machine guns, and assault rifles, a country that was at the height of power after conquering almost all of Europe, to experience such a catastrophic and complete defeat? In this series, we will analyze why the top-notch engineering and advanced technology that should have been key to victory in a military sense were either misguided or inadequate, and especially how the reckless, incompetent, and sometimes insane decisions of the dictator led to the inevitable defeat of the Nazi war machine. By the start of the war, the Nazis had developed 4 types of panzer tanks. The Panzer I and II were essentially training tanks for crews, and were already outdated at the very beginning of the war. The Nazis intended to fight with the Panzer III and IV tanks. The problem was that at the start of the war, they simply didn't have enough of them. They only had 680 Panzer III and IV tanks, so they used all 4 types of tanks in the conquest of Poland and during the campaign in France. The Panzer III was designed as a tank with a high-velocity gun that would be used primarily for fighting other tanks, while the Panzer IV was intended as a tank for infantry support with a short-barreled gun that would destroy enemy fortifications and artillery with high-explosive shells. It cannot be emphasized enough how important, if not decisive, Hitler was in the development and failure of the Nazi tanks. Hitler was constantly meddling in everything, including tank production, continually demanding the installation of bigger guns, thicker armor, and other improvements. By early 1940, he was already demanding that a 70mm gun be installed in the Panzer. In Nazi Germany, Hitler's demands were immediately carried out without question. Since the Panzer IV was a larger tank, it was logical to install a bigger gun on it. As a result, a whole series of Panzer IV tanks emerged with increasingly larger guns and thicker armor, which gradually increased from 30mm to 80mm. Since Hitler's order was that each tank leaving the factory must be better than the last, enormous resources and time were spent on upgrading old tanks. For example, a tank that came into the factory for repairs wasn't just repaired. Additional metal plates were added to increase the armor's thickness as well as a more powerful gun. This approach to tank production severely strained and slowed down the production of new tanks, but it also completely hindered mass production, which the Nazis desperately needed. The basic premise of mass production is to produce identical items in as large quantities as possible, but when changes are constantly introduced, production must be altered accordingly, thus paralyzing mass production completely. Due to the Nazi mindset, Germany's armored units were largely victims of their own success. After victories on the Western Front, the Nazis concluded that it wasn't necessary to prioritize the development of the heavy tank that had been planned since 1937. They believed that the existing Panzer III and IV tanks were more than sufficient to finish the war. The Nazis experienced a real shock on the Eastern Front at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, with the appearance of the Soviet T-34 and the heavy KV-1 tanks, which marked the beginning of true madness in Nazi tank production. This shock was both military and ideological, as the Nazis, who viewed Russians as an inferior race in their ideology, could not believe that such an inferior nation could produce a tank superior in all aspects: speed, armor, and mobility. General Guderian then established a commission to travel to Russia and resolve the issue with the T-34. The simplest solution was to simply reverse engineer and copy the T-34, and the Germans seriously considered this option. However, as usual, Hitler intervened and in late 1941 ordered the production of a new tank with a 75mm gun and 100mm armor, leading to the creation of the 48-ton Panzer V, which Hitler personally renamed the Panther in 1944. The production of the Panther began in December 1942, and the first completed examples were delivered for the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The Panther weighed 48 tons, had sloped front armor 100 mm thick, and a high-velocity 75 mm gun. It was powered by a 700 horsepower Maybach V12 gasoline engine with a top speed of 48 km per hour. The Panther was ultimately built with the classic German design, with the engine located in the rear and a drive shaft that supplied power to the front drive sprocket. As per Hitler's orders, the tank was sent into battle without any serious testing, and the main problem was reliability. A significant number of Panthers broke down even before reaching the battlefield. The problems were numerous: engine overheating, leaking fuel pumps which often caused fires in the engine compartment, a very complex and sensitive transmission that could not tolerate any misuse, as well as the entire drive system, including the drive shaft and the final drive. Of the 200 Panthers delivered for the Battle of Kursk, 2 were destroyed due to fires in the engine compartment during unloading from the train, and 14 broke down before reaching the front. The battle began with 184 operational Panthers, but 2 days later, only 41 remained operational. According to reports, 85 could be repaired, 16 required factory repairs, 56 were totally destroyed by the enemy or their crews, and 2 were destroyed due to fires in the engine compartment. The operational Panthers proved their worth and potential, destroying 267 Soviet T-34s. The official kill ratio in the Battle of Kursk was 7-1, but this statistic could easily be inaccurate, as it includes tanks that the Soviets destroyed after they broke down on the battlefield. An interesting American statistic states that to destroy 1 Panther, 5 Shermans or 9 Soviet T-34s would have to be lost, which is likely not entirely accurate, since the T-34 was a better tank than the Sherman. The total production of Panthers during the entire war amounted to less than 6,000 units. Similar to the Panther, after reading battlefield reports from the East, especially those describing how the T-34 could be destroyed by an 88 mm anti-aircraft gun, Hitler decided to prioritize the heavy tank project from 1937 once again. But, as usual, he demanded that the tank be equipped with a high-velocity 88 mm gun and a high level of armor protection against existing and future anti-tank weapons. Porsche and Henschel both developed prototypes for the Tiger tank, while Krupp designed and built the turrets for both tanks, later produced by Wegmann. Porsche was more innovative in his design and presented a prototype powered by a combination of a diesel engine and an electric motors. However, after his model first got stuck in the mud during a presentation and then caught fire, the production contract was awarded to Henschel. Since Ferdinand Porsche was Hitler's favorite engineer, he was so confident he would win the competition that he had already ordered 100 chassis of his tank version, which, with Hitler's special approval, would be turned into the Ferdinand tank. Henschel began production in August 1942, and the Tiger tank weighed 56 to 57 tons, with 100 millimeters of frontal armor and 80 millimeters of side armor. It was equipped with a high-velocity 88 millimeters gun and initially powered by a Maybach V12 gasoline engine producing 650 horsepowers, later upgraded to 700 horsepowers, with a top speed of 38 kilometers per hour on roads and 10 to 20 kilometers per hour off-road. The development of the Tiger tank lasted throughout its production, with Henschel desperately attempting to eliminate the numerous weaknesses of the tank. Like the Panther, the Tiger suffered from several issues. It was too slow, the engine was too weak for a tank of its weight, and overheated, fuel pumps leaked and caused fires, and the semi-automatic transmission was extremely unreliable, along with the entire drive shaft and final drive system. The Maybach engine in the 57-ton tank couldn't reliably operate at its maximum power of 3,000 RPM, so drivers were instructed not to exceed 2,600 RPM, which was nearly impossible in combat. Additionally, the transmission and drivetrain simply couldn't handle the inertia and kinetic energy of the tank during combat on the battlefield, resulting in frequent breakdowns. The tank also required frequent servicing every 250 kilometers, which was unachievable in the field, especially during extended operations. A particular problem for both the Tiger and Panther was the enormous fuel consumption of the Maybach V12 engine, which, when driving gently on roads, consumed 300 liters per 100 kilometers, and this doubled off-road, rapidly depleting its 534-liter fuel tank. This often led to situations where crews had to abandon or destroy their tanks on the battlefield, simply because they ran out of fuel. An additional logistical issue for the Tiger was transportation by rail. In order for the Tiger to fit on a rail car, its combat tracks 755 millimeters wide had to be removed and replaced with transport tracks 520 millimeters wide, creating massive logistical problems. During the winter on the Eastern Front, the Tiger also faced significant issues due to its overlapping wheel system, which would trap large amounts of ice and snow, causing the wheels to frequently become stuck. All of these problems gave the Tiger a very limited operational range, which the Soviets and Allies were well aware of and could exploit. In combat, however, a functional Tiger was the absolute ruler of the battlefield. It could destroy a T-34 from over 1,500 meters, and at distances of 1,000 meters, its shell would not only penetrate the T-34's frontal armor, but would go deeper and destroy the engine in the rear of the tank, often hitting the rear hull in 80% of cases. On the other hand, the T-34 had to get closer than 300 meters to have any chance of causing significant damage to the Tiger. The Tiger's advantage was further enhanced by its enormous projectile initial velocity of 773 to 930 meters per second, which made its shot trajectory almost flat, with a drop of less than a meter at 1,000 meters. This allowed the gunner to misestimate the distance of the target by 200 meters and still hit the enemy tank. The superiority of the Tiger is illustrated by the example of tank commander Franz Staudger, who encountered a group of about 50 T-34s during the Battle of Kursk. During this engagement, Staudger destroyed 22 Soviet T-34s, and upon returning to base, it was determined that his Tiger had been hit 67 times by various projectiles, but none had caused significant damage. The total production of the Tiger throughout the war amounted to 1,355 units. Porsche's design of the Tiger, with the chassis he had ordered in advance by Hitler's decree, became the Ferdinand tank. Porsche was unable to install the 88mm gun in his tank with a rotating turret, so he eventually abandoned the turret and mounted the gun in a casemate. A total of 90 Ferdinands were delivered for the Battle of Kursk, where they destroyed 216 Soviet T-34s, with a loss of 12 Ferdinand tanks. However, an additional 36 tanks broke down before or shortly after the start of the battle, after which the remaining Ferdinands were renamed Elephants and sent to the Italian front. The major flaw of the Ferdinand, aside from its unreliability, was that Porsche had failed to equip it with any machine guns, making it completely useless in close combat and highly vulnerable to infantry attacks. In their arrogant madness, the Nazis created subtypes of the Panther and Tiger tanks, called the Jag Panther and Jag Tiger, most likely in response to the Soviet Su-85 and Su-100. These vehicles featured a casemate instead of a rotating turret, of course, with even stronger guns, but these tanks came too late and in too small numbers to have any real impact on the war. They clearly illustrate the Nazi madness, where, In a situation where they were running out of all necessary resources, they produced the Jag Tiger, which weighed 78 tons. In their arrogance, the Nazis wasted desperately needed resources on a problem they did not have, further developing firepower and armor at a time when their existing tanks already had excellent and perfectly strong guns and armor, thus exacerbating the real problem of insufficient production. Although many issues with the Tiger were not solved, in 1943, Henschel once again won the contract to produce the King Tiger after competing with Porsche, and Krupp designed and produced the turrets. The King Tiger weighed an incredible 68.5 tons, was powered by the same Maybach V12 gasoline engine of 700 horsepower as the Panther and Tiger, had sloped armor of 185 millimeters, and a high-velocity 88mm gun. However, compared to the Tiger, which had the same caliber gun, the amount of propellant was doubled. Due to the extremely thirsty engine, the fuel tank was increased to 860 liters, but even with this, the range was only 100 to 120 kilometers on the battlefield. A total of 492 units were produced. All the Tiger's shortcomings were further amplified on the King Tiger. So, in addition to the standard problems with the underpowered engine and the inadequate transmission and drivetrain, a new issue emerged with the tracks, which were extremely sensitive to lateral stress while driving over rough terrain. This caused every other tooth on the drive sprocket to be in contact with the tracks, leading to accelerated wear on both the drive sprocket and the tracks themselves. The problems were so severe that the first 5 units delivered to the Panzer Lehr Division broke down before they even reached the battlefield and had to be destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. On the battlefield, an operational King Tiger struck fear into anyone who came into the line of fire from its 88mm gun, which was so powerful that its shell would pass straight through a Sherman tank at distances of nearly 3 kilometers. No Allied weapon could penetrate the front armor of the King Tiger, and thus, not a single King Tiger was destroyed in the war by a hit to its frontal armor. The power of the King Tiger was demonstrated by the attack of Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann in Normandy, where he, on his own, attacked a column of Allied tanks and, in a 15-minute assault, destroyed 14 tanks, 15 supporting vehicles, and 2 anti-tank guns before his tank was disabled by an artillery hit to the tracks. In the end, the vast majority of King Tigers were abandoned or destroyed by their crews after breaking down or running out of fuel. The peak of madness and Hitler's obsession with heavy tanks came with the demand for an invincible tank weighing at least 120 tons. Ferdinand Porsche eagerly responded to this demand, and in May 1943 presented a wooden model of the Maus tank, which, after the usual interventions from Hitler, demanding thicker armor of 200 millimeters and a larger 128 millimeter gun, grew to an incredible 188 tons. Hitler eagerly ordered 150 units, but 5 months later, Speer cancelled the order, yet Hitler still commanded that the 2 prototypes be completed. By the end of the war, 2 hulls and 1 turret were produced, and the completed tank was deployed to defend Berlin, although there is no evidence that the tank ever fired a shot. The Soviets destroyed the tank's hull, and after the war, the turret of the destroyed tank was attached to the unfinished hull. This tank is now located in the Tank Museum in Kubinka. Hitler was a megalomaniac who always believed that bigger was better, and he envisioned heavy tanks as fortresses against waves of Soviet tanks would crash, capable of easily piercing any defense line. In this line of thinking, he completely overlooked the fact that, in addition to enemy tanks, there are other dangers that tanks face on the battlefield. Regardless of the power of the gun and the thickness of the front armor, heavy tanks remain vulnerable to flank and rear attacks, anti-tank mines, anti-tank obstacles, and air attacks. The Allies maximized this vulnerability, and for instance, just for the defense of Kursk, the Soviets placed 545,000 anti-tank mines. Generals aware of these dangers placed heavy tanks at the spearhead of the attack, behind which followed medium tanks and infantry, exploiting and expanding the breakthrough area, while the heavy tanks would continue past the breakthrough to destroy enemy artillery. This approach could have been extremely successful if they had enough reliable and operational heavy tanks, but the reality was completely different. There were never enough heavy tanks for the planned operations. There were always too few, and their notorious unreliability further reduced their numbers. The slow speed of the heavy tanks, as well as their limited operational range due to fuel consumption and logistics, meant that in battles, medium tanks would arrive too quickly and then have to overtake the heavy tanks, suffering tremendous losses in the process. The Nazis, in their madness and arrogant sense of superiority, made a fundamental mistake from the very beginning of designing heavy tanks. Due to the lack of an appropriate engine, they chose the Maybach V12 gasoline engine, which was far from ideal for heavy tanks. In comparison, the Soviets used the extremely reliable diesel V12 engine with 500 horsepower for the T-34, which was in every way a far better choice for a tank. Not only did it consume 4 times less fuel, but its diesel torque was much better suited to handle the weight of the tank and placed far less strain on the transmission and final drive. This is why diesel engines are still used in tanks and heavy machinery today. After choosing the wrong engine, the Nazis had to design highly complicated transmissions in an attempt to give the tank at least somewhat acceptable performance. The driveshaft and final drive were the Achilles heel of all German heavy tanks, mostly because they were never adequately tested. In their rush to deliver tanks to the battlefield as quickly as possible, manufacturers conducted minimal tests only on test ranges, while real tests on difficult terrain were overlooked. Still, despite all the shortcomings, the greatest and most crucial problem was the prohibitively expensive and small-scale production of tanks that were too complicated for mass production, and the constant changes in design made any attempt at mass production impossible. Another big problem was the overall lack of resources and materials, forcing factories to use lower quality materials, which significantly increased the number of breakdowns. The Nazis completely disregarded basic military principles in the development of their tanks. Instead of developing simple and robust tanks in large numbers, they opted for technologically advanced, yet complicated and expensive models, wasting enormous and increasingly scarce resources while pushing logistics far beyond their breaking point. In the end, the numbers speak for themselves. While the Soviets produced 55,000 T-34s, over 6,500 heavy KV tanks, and the Americans produced 50,000 Shermans, the Nazis produced only 6,000 Panthers, 1,355 Tigers, and 492 King Tigers. Ultimately, World War II was a war of attrition, fought with enormous armies over vast territories, where advanced technology only provided an advantage if it could be produced in massive quantities, something the Soviets identified very early on. The T-34 had the ideal balance between firepower, mobility, and protection, but more importantly, it was simple, reliable, and could be produced in large quantities. The Soviets continually developed the T-34 throughout the war, but the core principle was that no change should reduce production. While the Nazis barely produced 1 Tiger per day, the Soviets produced 48 T-34s daily, which, despite losing 45,000 T-34s during the war, proved to be the decisive factor that led to a victory over Nazi tanks.